Hello out there. Welcome to this evening's program. I'm Dr. Amanda Dye, and tonight we are talking about writing for health professions, the third event in our series of writing-related events. And we are going to be talking specifically about writing the experiences section of an application. So I think that this is a really interesting counterpart to some of the stuff that we've talked about previously in the series regarding writing a personal statement. I think there are some ways that we can really think about these two parts of the application as counterpoints and foils for one another. And so with that in mind, I am going to go ahead and share my slides and get us going. So for today, my goals are really to talk a little bit about the importance of the experiences section. In some applications, it's called experiences, and some it's called work and activities. It has different names, but the same purpose in every application. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that purpose is. Then I'm going to give you some of my tips to help present yourself and your experiences. And if time allows, we'll do a little bit of practice evaluating example entries. So pretty simple agenda, just a few different things. So we'll start with my tips for getting started on this section. If you've done the committee application, you're going to be familiar with the format already. It's really similar to the professional preparation section of our application. And the reason that we have that section at all is because centralized application services typically do not accept a resume or a CV, and instead they ask you to present some of the information that you might share in a document like that in a different format. So typically in a work and activities or experiences section, you're going to be writing in prose about your experiences to describe a little bit about what you've done. In the AMCAS application, which is our most popular centralized application, you get 700 characters as a baseline for each of your experiences. You also have the possibility to designate some experiences as most meaningful. In AMCAS, that's up to 3 experiences, and you get some more space to write about those. We'll talk a little bit about that. Most of the centralized application services do limit the number of things that you can share in an activity section, and in AMCAS, that's up to 15 different entries. They all will provide you with preset categories. Every application service has its own list, but there are usually a lot of different categories. So things like research, of course, but also work experience in a clinical setting, work experience in a non-clinical setting, artistic activities, hobbies, et cetera, et cetera. Professional programs are really interested in these sections because they want to know how you've spent your time as part of your preparation for your application process. And, you are what you do to a certain extent in this application process. And so showing that your commitments, the things that you're talking about being interested in, for example, in your personal statement, are things that align with the way that you've spent your time over the past few years is a really important part of the process. Like the personal statement, experiences sections are important for letting admissions officers know what's really important to you as a candidate. But the twist is that they allow you to present this information in a different and somewhat more directed way than the personal statement. So when we talk about the personal statement, we're often talking about an approach where we're trying to get across, for lack of a better word, a vibe. We want an admissions officer to kind of understand something about your individual perspective. It's not really the best use of that space to catalog your individual experiences and relate each of them to your professional goals, because the experiences section is there to do exactly that. And one thing that I always tell people is that admissions officers are going to concentrate on this section. When I was working in admissions, I spent the majority of my time in an application looking at the experiences section and really trying to understand how a person spent their time and really developed and followed their interests. When you're choosing which experiences to list in your application, you want to think about a lot of different factors. So, being able to demonstrate the different facets of your experience, choosing things that really represent everything that's as that's important to you in the context of this application. You also want to think about the level of commitment that you can demonstrate in this kind of a setting. So a mix of activities with different levels of commitment is absolutely okay. There is no expectation that you are only recording activities that you've spent years doing, right? Some of your activities might take place over the course of a couple of years. Some of your activities might be really long-term. Some of them might be a few months or a semester, something like that. It's a good idea, of course, to have some experiences that do demonstrate long-term engagement, but that's not going to be every single one. And you also want to think about the kind of impact on your schedule overall. So if something has been consistently a part of your life, even if it's a small number of hours per week, or if it was an experience that happened over a shorter period of time, but a really intensive experience, thinking about, how much time you actually put into this activity is important. Application services are going to ask you to classify all of your experiences, and they'll provide you with preset categories for doing so. It is very common for people to find that activities fit into more than one category potentially, and that's absolutely okay as well. But you do have to make a decision as an applicant about how you're going to categorize. So I always encourage people to think about what the experience meant to you, what you gained from it, what is the sort of main thrust of this experience, the reason that you're including it to help you with classification. And if you really feel like there's some ambiguity, something is, excuse me, very evenly split between two potential categories, I think ultimately you choose the one that you think is the best fit. If it's, 51% versus 49, then pick 51 and use the space that you have to write about the experience to make your responsibilities and, kind of the breadth of the experience as clear as possible, even if that category label isn't the perfect fit. There are a lot of research experiences like this, so it's very common for, say, a clinical research experience to be maybe mostly research, but to have some clinical components. And so typically you would classify that as a research experience, but then be sure to clarify in your description, these are the clinical responsibilities that you had as well. When you're calculating hours to add in an application, you want to be honest and as careful as you can in your calculation or estimation. So it doesn't have to be a documented specific number of hours. Obviously, if it's something that you've done for work, you'll probably have pay stubs and things like that to document it. But for volunteer experiences, it's really, it's up to you to report that information. Admissions personnel can use the information you provide to calculate a particular number of hours per week based on the data you've provided. I would sometimes do that as an admissions officer if I saw a very high number of hours in a relatively short period of time. Just mathematically, were there this number of hours in the time period cited here? So making sure not to overestimate and being careful to make sure that you're choosing the right start and end dates for your experience are also really important. That's also an extra thing to know. Some application services will let you specify multiple date ranges, which is super helpful if your involvement with something is non-continuous. Let's say a research experience that you did for 2 different summers, but not the academic year in between, or if your hours per week differed over time. If you had an experience where you have like a continuous number of hours and you want to kind of put all of them together, you can also include a little bit about hours per week in the description. So if you wanted to say, I worked for a solid 12 months in this lab, but I was working part-time during the academic year and full-time during the summers, that's something that you can clarify as well. When you're thinking about how many experiences you should include, I would say that most successful applicants are going to have upwards of 10 to 11 entries, but it's better to list fewer than 15 than to stretch it to fill all of the spaces. So I would rather see 12, 13, 14 experiences than some sort of filler entries, things that aren't necessarily as relevant or things that you don't have as much to say about in your activities list. If you have kind of the opposite problem, you've got too many things, we definitely have a lot of folks who are applying after they've graduated and maybe have really cool work experiences and so are deciding between, maybe some things that they've done after they've graduated and some things that were important to them as undergrad. That's very understandable. And you can definitely think about grouping your experiences, particularly for experience types like shadowing, honors and awards, hobbies, publications. I always encourage people, don't use more than one entry for these, because these are rarely things that you're going to have a ton to say about in terms of like your own contribution to those activities. So I would say, try to group all of those things together and use, one entry for awards, where you maybe talk about the awards that you want to highlight, and if there's anything specific that you want to be sure that that the admissions committee knows about a particular award, you can say that. For shadowing, often the same thing. Most people will have a few different shadowing experiences if they shadow, and it's often the case that those aren't adding up to a ton of hours each. So you can use those multiple date ranges to kind of indicate different times when you shadowed, and then not take up so much space in your application with talking about those experiences. Alternatively, you can group related experiences together. So let's say you have a research experience from which a publication came. You could mention the publication in the context of your research entry. You don't necessarily have to have a separate entry for the publication if you don't have the space for it. If you have worked at any point in your preparation, especially if you've been working to support yourself or your family, please include your jobs. Professional schools really do value the ability to understand the balance of a person's life. And they understand that, some people have to work while they're in school. And it's really, really helpful for them to know how much of your time you spent doing that, so that they can understand, the context in which your application is being presented, right? So if you maybe haven't had as much time to volunteer because you had to spend a lot of hours working, it's really important to let schools know that, so that they can use that information in understanding your application. When it comes to the type of work that you've done, the specific relevance to medicine or dentistry or other health professions is not the primary concern here. Many, many, many kinds of jobs are going to ask you to build or develop skills that are important for healthcare. Customer service skills, strong communication skills, these are things that come up in a lot of different kinds of jobs. And so, a job that's in the service industry might not seem like something that is directly related to an interest in a career in medicine, but you can still think about the ways in which you've learned things from those roles that you can import into your understanding of what it's going to mean to be a medical student and eventually a practitioner. So considering those skills, transferable skills, we usually call them, that you can bring out in your descriptions of these experiences are important. And as I said, this information is so important because it really adds needed context to your application. If you've had experiences outside the US, those are absolutely fine to include. Professional programs are very open. Many professional programs allow their students to conduct international experiences, research or elective rotations, things like that. And so those kinds of experiences can really be valued. They can be a great counterpoint to experiences in the US. They can help you to sort of understand different health systems in practice. And so you should not worry about the fact of including those experiences, but you should think really carefully about the way you frame those experiences. So it is sometimes the case that people will talk about experiences abroad as experiences that are maybe transformative. And this can be particularly a source of some tension if we're talking about, an experience that maybe you've had in a developing country or a really underserved area, even within this country. So if you're going to frame something as a particularly transformative experience, you want to actually be able to draw out in your description what changed about you, the way you view your professional plans, the way you understand the responsibilities of the profession to the group of people that you worked with, et cetera. So you don't want it to be like sort of a bland transformative. You want to be really clear about how an experience changed you, if that's something you want to say. And the second thing that is incredibly important is Sometimes standards of care outside the United States are not the same as they are inside the United States. And it has happened at many points that US-based students who have worked or shadowed or volunteered abroad have been allowed to do things that are really not appropriate for pre-health students in this country. So, an example would be if and a student who is an observer maybe is in a rural area somewhere and there are very few hands and the supervising doctor says, hey, can you, stitch up this patient or something like that. If you're providing actual care, that's not something you're supposed to be doing. But of course, I recognize there are a lot of factors that can go into situations like that. If you have had an experience like that, we should probably talk about it. You should also definitely just, take a look at the guidelines. I've linked them here and I'll share the slides with you all about providing patient care abroad in any point when you're describing your responsibilities. So you want to make sure that whatever you're sharing with medical schools or dental schools, et cetera, is within the scope of what is expected for a pre-health student from the US. Oftentimes people will ask me, what do I think about including experiences that could be divisive in some way or political? So, for example, if you are somebody who's worked in an office of an abortion provider, or if you've been involved with union organizing, right? These are things that can speak a little bit to your politics, things that are important to you. And I would encourage you to think about what you want to share about the experience and why. It's really important to think about whether that particular experience is representative of things that you want to continue doing. So if you're, part of your goal in your career is to be an abortion provider, I think that it's fair to share that in your application. And the reason that I think that is because any experience that you have could elicit a strong response from an application reader. It's very unpredictable. People have their prejudices and their own experiences. And so something that you consider relatively anodyne could be something that kind of rubs somebody else the wrong way. And so since you don't have control over the way another person is going to receive your experiences, I think what you can think about is whether you'd be happy in a place where work that you consider really important and central to your values is judged negatively. So my kind of wisdom here is, if you want to share it, it's important to think about why. And if it's something that's important to you, then I think you want to hopefully find yourself in a place that agrees that this is an okay thing to think is important, even if the, your specific position is not something that the entire institution would expect to agree with. In a similar way, outing experiences that might give clues about your particular identities, protected identities that aren't necessarily something that admissions committees can or should be making decisions about. I always encourage people to think about whether they're sharing information that could clue the reader in elsewhere in the application. Of course, there's no harm in talking about working for trans rights if you've identified yourself as a trans person in your personal statement. There's never anything wrong with doing any of these things. But if you are sharing these things, it's really important, again, to understand or to think for yourself about whether understanding this fact about you is really important for understanding your perspective as a student or a future practitioner. And so, an example would be if you're a queer identified person, and that's a really central part of your mission for becoming a healthcare provider, to work with queer communities and to address specific concerns for those communities, then it makes sense to share experiences that have helped you, to really build on your competencies. You may not have to share information about, your own particular identity in order to do that, but you shouldn't feel worried about sharing experiences that point to the things that you think are important. If it's information, by contrast, that is somewhat more incidental, so if you have, say, a religious identity that really isn't something that is central to your mission, maybe, there are some underlying values there that are really part of the reason you want to become a health professional. I think talking about those values rather than talking about a particular identity is probably, a safe way to go. And so again, ultimately, I don't think there's anything wrong with sharing these kinds of experiences. I think it's just an individual decision based on a careful consideration of why you're sharing. As I mentioned before, some application services do allow you to designate up to 3 experiences, or in the case of ADSAS, the dental school application, up to 6 experiences as what we call most meaningful experiences. In the AMCAS application, this results in you getting almost 200% more space. So 1,325 additional characters to write about the experience. These are usually referred to as reflection statements. And in practice, they're like mini essays about why this particular experience was important for you. This is one of the main reasons why I think it's so helpful to focus the personal statement away from cataloging activities, because you get so much extra space, especially in the AMCAS application, to really reflect individually on experiences and to talk a little bit about why this particular experience has been formative or important for your development as a pre-health student. So for these experiences, it's really important to try to choose experiences that represent different facets of your portfolio, thinking about breadth. And you can consider whether you have letters of recommendation that align with these experiences. To be clear, that's not a hard and fast rule by any stretch of the imagination. So there does not have to be a one-to-one correspondence between most meaningful activity and a letter of recommendation, but often most meaningful activities are places where you may have relationships with people who could be good letter writers. When it comes to future experiences, it is very important to know, if you're, everybody's planning to do something during their application year, whether you're going to be in school or whether you are working or researching or all sorts of things. You can only list activities in your application that you have begun at the time you submit your application. So, if your goal is to submit your application on June 3rd, you can list anything that you have started up until June 3rd of this year. AMCAS will allow you to estimate future hours. So let's say you're a person who is a year into a job and is going to be working in a job for the next year as you're, kind of going through your application year. That's easy. You can have a date range for the year that you've already completed, and then another date range to log your expected hours over the course of the coming year. It's really important to do that for things that are in progress, and schools are going to be mostly concerned with work that you've already completed at the time you submit your application. It is important to know that ADIA ADSAS, which is the dental school application, and ACOMAS, the DO school application, only accept hours that you have completed, so you cannot include future hours for in-progress experiences there. If you have an experience, that you're kind of new at, that you're including, try to use the description space to clarify, the responsibilities, the duties that you're going to have. And of course, remember that in secondary applications and hopefully in interviews, you're going to be able to provide some additional details about ongoing experiences there. For folks who have, been doing their preparation during the era of COVID, it is definitely something to keep in mind that schools are very well aware of the fact that experiences have been attenuated, I feel like I'm going to sneeze, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, if there is an interruption in your involvement in a particular activity, or, you weren't able to get into a clinical setting for a while, everybody understands that. And it's okay, if you're including an activity where you have maybe a fewer number of hours than you would like to because you were affected by the pandemic, you can acknowledge that in your description. And I think just really paying attention to lessons that you took from that situation, what you were able to learn in the time that you spent with the activity. And if you started any new experiences in response to the pandemic, lots of people worked in vaccination clinics and other kinds of things. So if you have the space to include those experiences, definitely do. Even if it was a small commitment, it's great to reflect on what it meant to be involved during this time. Okay. So with all of that said, I want to talk a little bit about the way that I encourage folks to approach writing about experiences. I think that there is there are some subtle arts to this process, and so I want to give you all some best practices for formulating your responses here. So I often talk about using something like the STAR method, which asks you to to describe the situation that you were in, the specific task that you were assigned, actions that you took, and any results that you uncovered, as a way to kind of just get the basics out there, right? So this is a way to definitely start a first draft of any experience. And it's really helpful to focus on achievements and outcomes rather than specific tasks. As in any situation where you're communicating about an experience, it's really helpful to tie your results to organizational goals where that's possible. So if that's like increasing engagement on a social media platform with an organization that you are working for, or if it has to do with achieving a particular number of participants being involved in a research study, if it's a question of like, expanding the membership of a group that you were a leader for, all of those kinds of things can be really helpful for schools to understand. So there's an example here where, I'm using quantification to help the reader understand, kind of my work relative to expectations. I give brief comments about kind of the technical things that I have done, and I, mentioned that there's a publication as a result of this research, because I don't want to have a separate entry for that publication for whatever reason. So again, this is a great way to start. When you are, once you have a draft of your description for each activity, I encourage you to revise with a few things in mind. As typical with writing for resumes and other kinds of documents like this, I would encourage you not to rely on adjectives and to use numbers when you can. Adjectives can sometimes feel like a little bit self-aggrandizing, and numbers can feel a little bit more objective to a certain degree. Definitely don't exaggerate your involvement. You don't need to, schools are not expecting that you have done absolutely everything. They're looking for experiences that are consistent with, sort of where you are developmentally. It's important to think about the appropriate level of detail. So, one of the challenges of writing these experiences is that you're given limited space. So like I said, an AMCAS application, that's 700 characters. It's a short paragraph. And so you want to think about what is, most important for schools to know. You don't have to communicate everything about a given experience. You should be planning to communicate about the most important things for a school to understand. And that includes, especially for research, you don't have to list all of the lab techniques that you learned or every single responsibility that you had within a job. You want to give the highlights, those most important pieces. Just as with the personal statement, revising is really key. And I always encourage folks to pay attention to content, structure, tone. You want the descriptions to sound like the person who wrote your personal statement, definitely. You want to make sure that the information that you're including, the content, is relevant. And you want to make sure that the way that you've written each of these short responses is structured in such a way that a person can easily follow it. I definitely encourage folks to use prose, sentences, not bullet points. You want to, show the reader that you have spent the time to really think about how you're presenting these things. It's important to be consistent with punctuation for readability. You want to think about how each of the experiences that you're choosing is forming a part of the narrative that you want to present as a student. So again, thinking about the story that you're telling and how each of your experiences relate. It's not expected that they're going to be, sort of linear, all, one leads to the next, right? It might be more of a web, a constellation of different experiences, but you want the reader to be able to understand the connections after reading your application. And again, this is a space that really helps you to contextualize your application. It's going to help the reader understand the choices that you've made, because you're really presenting those engagements, those activities, with an eye toward what you've learned from them. Okay, so for the sort of mid to last section of this, I have some examples of a few different entries. Names and identifying details have been changed, but they are entries written by past applicants, all of which I think have some good points and some points where they could be improved. And so what I usually do in this session is ask folks to just kind of take a moment and read through an entry and think about, based on what you know now, what are the things that you think are positive about the entry, and what are the things that you think, could be a question that you have, or a place that you think the entry could be improved. So we'll do a couple of these. I'll just ask, that you think for yourself. So I'll give you a couple minutes to take a look, and then I'll show you the next slide, which has my thoughts about each of these things. So we'll do a couple of examples, and then I think skip through some of them so that we can get to the end of the discussion. But I will share slides that have all of these examples in them, so you can go through them on your own. Yeah, so that's what I have just said, right? Okay, so I'm going to give you the first example, and I'm going to give you just a moment to Okay, so I'm gonna skip through to my thoughts about this. So things that I really like about this entry. It's a full academic year commitment, high hours of involvement, so definitely seems like something that's been important. I love that the language that's used is accessible to non-specialists. This is something that's really important to me when I'm reading an entry about research. I want to understand why the research is important, not necessarily kind of know all of the vocabulary of the particular field. And I think that the description does a really good job of connecting the experience to future interests. And so I don't necessarily have a critique of this example, but my question after reading it is, this isn't a most meaningful activity. So, is this a student who's not interested in research moving forward? Is that something that's being reflected in the list of schools that the applicant is applying to? So it's something that I think you want to keep in mind, how each of your experiences is really hitting the eyes of the application reviewers. And if you're a person who's, really interested in research, continuing research, you want to think about how that appears to the schools that you're applying to. Okay, another example, and I'll give you a little more time to read this one because it's longer. Okay. So some of my thoughts about this entry. I really like that it uses quantification to help provide context about, what the person has accomplished. And they provide really detailed information about the kinds of measures that they used, which is really great for kind of understanding a research engagement. Things that raise questions for me about this is that it's a most meaningful activity, but it's a relatively short commitment, only 3 months. And so I would want to think about how this compares to the other most meaningful activities in the application. Is it the only experience that's this short that's being identified? Is there something special about it to this applicant? I also think that the most meaningful remarks meander a little bit, and they could be a little bit more focused. So they're giving a lot of detail about different vignettes, different experiences, more detail about the research, and not necessarily helping the reader to understand why they've identified this as most meaningful. So I think these two questions kind of go together for me. One of the things that I would address if I were putting an activity that was a relatively short commitment as a most meaningful is really, I would address that head on in the reflection. This is a short experience, but it was really important to me for the following reasons, etc. Okay, so now that we've done a couple of examples, I think you get the point, and you'll be able to go through some of the other examples that I'll share in the PowerPoint and, do the same thing. Read through, think what you think, and then you'll see on each of the next slides the things that come to my mind. So I'm going to skip through some of those really quickly. And come back to the presentation and wrap this up with a few of my last thoughts about writing about experiences. What I always say to candidates, because so many people are rightly concerned about how do I stand out in the application process? What's going to make my application really, pop for admissions officers? And what I say in my my events about the personal statement is really the same as what I'm going to say here. Your uniqueness does not come from the activities themselves. It comes from your ability to express why those activities were meaningful. As I say here, nobody else has had your experiences from your perspective. And so even though most people who are submitting these applications have had research experiences and clinical experiences and service experiences, things that have the same contours, the differences that schools are going to be able to see are in the way that you reflect on those experiences. Being able to express yourself in writing is a skill that takes a lot of time to develop, but it's a very important one for this application process and for every application process you're going to have moving forward. And so I think doing what you can to make sure that every single piece of writing in your application, not just the personal statement, but also this section, really speaks to why you are doing the things that you are pursuing, right? You want your experiences to tell that story to admissions personnel and to help them understand what you care about through the lens of how you've spent your time. Some more practical last thoughts. Take care if you're using technical language, especially if you're writing about research. You want to make sure that a non-specialist gets something out of what you're writing. And if the person is getting tripped up in a lot of long words that they maybe aren't super familiar with, it's probably not going to really hit with them, right? And so what you want, if you're describing, for example, a research experience, is, for the reader to understand the big picture. Why is it important? So, maybe the exact molecular mechanism is not the most important thing. Understanding the broader goals, the broader implications of your research, which is always an important thing to be thinking about. That's really what you want to focus on here. If you are writing about clinical experiences and you are, putting in any information regarding patients that you've worked with, please as always, use those details with care. Only share what you need to make your point. Please try to, read through, make sure that nothing that you're writing could come across as condescending or judgmental, and that you are showing respect for the learning experience that those patients have given to you. If you're writing about a negative experience, maybe something that an experience that you had that was a tough thing for some reason, but was also something important for you, focus on what was important. Focus on the reasons why you're sharing this experience rather than, a critique of the system or something like that. And of course, remember not to overgeneralize, right? Think about how far you can draw conclusions based on the experience that you have. And remember that there is no expectation that you know everything at this stage. The people who are reading your application understand that you are still at the beginning of your professional trajectory. They don't expect you to be somewhere much more advanced at this stage. What they expect is that you're coming in with a curiosity, and with skills and competencies that are really, really important for their programs. So that's all. I'm going to make sure to share this presentation with everyone, and I thank you all so much for taking a look. I wish you lots of luck as you are writing these activity descriptions, or hopefully working from things that you've written for the committee application to revise them. It's a great opportunity really to get your personality, to get what's important to you across to admissions officers. So don't take that for granted. It's definitely an important part of the application. Keep your eyes and ears open for further announcements about writing supports. I am working with the writing fellows to try to establish some times to offer conferences for applicants. And of course, I will be around to answer questions as you have them. So thanks again, and good luck.